Dear friends, welcome to a new program. I would call today the history of education. Our guest again is Mr. John Mackay, International Director for Creation Research Australia. Welcome, good to see you again.
Thank you, Romulus.
We're having a rather interesting subject that we have to still squeeze in a half hour, graciously provided by Alfa Omega TV. We know, this is a fact, that if we are to look for roots for our educational systems, for our education, we should rather check our Bibles and our Christian heritage. Would you comment on that, please?
It is interesting, like, as you know, I've lectured in geology and been involved in geology for a long time, and it is intriguing to note that geology itself did not even exist in the ancient world. Now, don't get me wrong, you know what I mean by mining. You dig up gold, you dig up metal, right? People have been mining for a long time because all that is involved is you have to believe in dollars and cents, you know, and money. You don't care about how the gold got into the rock or where the fossil oil or coal came from. Now, geology as a subject did not even commence until after the Reformation, by and large. And actually, do you know who invented the word geology? See, these words had to be invented.
Yes.
And you made a comment about Christian influence, yes. And this is a classic example. It was the Bishop of Durham who invented the word geology.
Excellent.
Now, the reason he needed to invent that word is that during the Middle Ages, while the academia was controlled largely by the Catholic Church, they had theology. Now, you've graduated in theology, so what's that?
The knowledge of God.
Yeah, the study, logos, the word, yes. The study, theos, God, right? So the study of God. But the minute you start to ask questions about rocks, okay, what are you studying? Well, you're studying the earth.
Yes.
So since the learned languages are then Latin and Greek, if we say theology for the study of God, then the study of the earth must be geology. Which actually does raise an interesting point. If a theologian graduates from theology, who graduates from geology? Should it be a geologian?
Yeah.
Right, but we don't use that word. We use the word geologist. But it does make a good point that these concepts grew out of a Christian worldview. And in fact, if you want to go one step further, why were they not possible prior to the coming of Christianity? Why were they only interested in minerals and money, right? And not in asking questions about the rocks? Basically, the answer has to be that there is another influence in education which is still there, regardless of the influence of Christianity. You've been to a gymnasium?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Do you know what the word means?
It was a sort of school or place where men improve their physical outlook.
Okay, a school is right for a start, but translated literally, it's the place to go naked.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
But it's from ancient Greece.
Yeah.
Now, even though, say, the Romans conquered the world and destroyed the Greek Empire, it was really the Greek mindset that conquered the Romans, and they took that wherever they went.
Yes, exactly.
And it's still in our education because we still have gymnasiums,
yes,
right?
We do.
And we apply it a lot further than they probably ever thought of. But in reality, if you want to see the hindering effect of Greek education, think about the subject we raised, geology. The ancient Greeks had a pagan religion, right? How many gods did they have?
Zillions.
Zillions of gods. And their gods were just like you, except bigger.
Yeah.
I know that's hard to imagine, but it's true, right? Now, their gods, if you could be deceitful, they could be deceitful.
Yeah.
If you could play jokes, they could play jokes. So if you put that in your mind as an educator, you didn't bother talking about rocks because the gods controlled the world that was out there. And so the rocks might be there to deceive you. So we know what the Greeks thought about fossils. They said, this is a trick put in the earth by the gods to deceive us. So they left them alone. And if you leave it alone, you can't ask questions. So there's a whole area of knowledge out here which is off limits to you. Now, do you remember the things the Greeks were good at?
They were good at war.
Well, they lost.
Yeah, yeah, they were good at literature.
Yeah,
arts.
all the things that happen up here.
Yes.
Philosophy,
Yes.
logic, art, mathematics, right? All the things you have to think about because the gods weren't controlling that, right? Man was the measure of all things. That goes right back to the ancient Greeks. So having said that, whilst it is true that the coming of Christianity has certainly opened many doors of information. Sadly, we are looking at a system which is lingering on behind it, so that many educators, even the Christian ones, still think Greek. And it shows up in, I guess you can say, almost a parallel system that's hidden behind there. So many Christian thinkers end up going off the rails simply because they were never on them in the first place.
Having said that, we still can say that Europe and the United States, which have both common history, gave the world the greatest intellect. We both know, and our viewers do know, that what has been achieved intellectually has been achieved in a period when the Christian thought came back into its rights. Okay? So Christianity in education, great minds, great achievements, industrial, literature, even philosophy, we may think of that. Has Christianity raised education? Is trying Christianity to regain some sort of basis in education?
You've heard the word sophisticated?
Yes.
Okay, it's based on the old sophist school. Now, do you remember, I mean, if I say you're sophisticated, most people take it as a compliment, correct?
Yes, I would not.
Good, because what were the sophists good at?
Well, to talk himself out of someone or into someone.
Just in other words, to make up a logical argument so that the argument and winning the argument became important, not the truth.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And criminal lawyers master this, don't they? The truth isn't the issue. The issue is winning the court case. Now, the problem with that is, of course, the difference between a Christian philosophy of truth and a non-Christian philosophy of truth is that in the Christian philosophy of truth, the truth ends up being a person. The person is Jesus Christ, and therefore his creation, because beyond a shadow of a doubt, the Bible teaches that Jesus Christ is the creator, right? And since the creation reflects his nature, we can actually have an absolute discussion of truth, because he is truth, therefore real truth exists on planet Earth. It is not just the consequence of you and I having a logical argument to reach the best theory. Now, the tragedy is science has gotten back to the old Greek concept of what truth is, so that when we teach theories today in science, it's merely an approximation of whatever the best argument is at the moment. I had a student I was addressing the Theological Society at St Andrews University, and he said, but surely what you're doing is saying creation is absolutely true, and that can't be acceptable to science. And I said, why did you say it that way? He said, because science has to have flexibility. We can't have any fixed answers. And I said, well, are you saying that if something is true, then science can't deal with it? And he thought, you could see it in his face, right? And he said, I've never thought of that. Right? In reality, so science has moved back to the ancient Greek sophist way of thinking. So the best theory, the best hypothesis is where we've gotten to. Now, if you want to re-establish a Christian basis of education, then you really have to say, here is what we know to be true, because someone who is wiser than us has told us. In fact, if we want to know what information is, or facts are, or what wisdom is, the Bible teaches that wisdom only comes from God, right? And wisdom is what we use to take facts, which by themselves are meaningless, right?
Yes.
And turn it into usable information. If you don't have access to wisdom, then you just take the facts and you arrange them according to this theory, and then somebody comes along and writes another PhD, and he arranges them according to this theory, and then you fight about it. Right? I remember when the universe was 20 billion years old. I know I don't look that old, but the fact is, as I was growing up, the latest theory was the universe was 20 billion years old. And then I was old enough to have been at university when somebody discovered they'd miscalculated the Hubble constant. And when they reinserted that into the theory, the universe went from 20 to 10 billion years old. Now you had two camps, right? The 20 billion year old astronomers and the 10 billion year old astronomers. Now guess what they did next? They met and they had a conference, and all of a sudden by the 1990s, the universe was 15 billion years old. Now, doesn't this sound like a search for truth to you? Right, really, it's just a compromise argument. And in fact, I did a debate against a physicist from Cambridge University, Dr. John Polkinghorne, and he publicly stated in the 1990s that the universe was 15 billion years old, but on the evening of my debate recently in Liverpool University, he said the universe was 14 billion years old. And I had to remind the audience of the humour of this, that in the 15 years since 1990, John Polkinghorne's got 15 years older, while the universe has got a billion years younger. So that none of these things are actual truth at all. So the first thing you need to do in establishing a Christian view of education is to realise that there's no facts, no truth which contradicts anything in Christianity. But there's plenty of the latest theories that disagree with everything in Christianity. But that's irrelevant. So therefore you need first of all the big picture. The big picture is God has actually told us the framework for truth. Inside of that, you can have lots of ways to investigate what the actual facts are, and then using God's wisdom, find a way to turn them into useful information, so that, you know, you were referring to America and the West giving us usable information.
Exactly.
Okay, so you have a look at our rockets to the moon. Now, we had to assume before we sent a rocket to the moon that whatever gravity was like on Earth, it was like on the moon. Now, we'd never been to the moon before. Now, why would we make the assumption? Because if you like Doctor Who or all the other science fictions, there could be a black hole there. We could have different rules, right? Any possible assumption is okay in theoretical physics. Why would we assume that whatever happens to an astronaut on Earth is what will happen to him on the moon? Well, do you know the word we use to describe the whole of everything you can see? Isn't it universe?
Yes.
Okay, what's the word universe mean?
Something that is bound to that unity, that one.
One, okay. Why do we have a universe? Answer, because there is one God who has made one creation, and it's based on Him. He has one set of laws because He's a unity. He is the one, right? So when you have a look at this creation, we even use words like universe, and therefore if God made the earth and God made the moon, the rules will be the same. Whew. Fortunately for Werner von Braun, who by the way was a creationist,
Yes, sir.
they had the same rules, so we shouldn't be surprised that the first book ever read publicly on the moon was Genesis chapter 1, because that was the philosophy of education, the big picture, which enabled us to take the facts of hydrogen burning and oxygen goes boom, and we'll move something to end up on the moon and discover more information. So that's the connection. And of course, coming out of the space things, don't you have non-stick fry pans now and non-stick pots and pans that are much easier to clean? Well, that all came out of the space race, okay? And all of our nice little digital watches and computers, they are all a consequence of the benefit of somebody saying, there is a God who made the world will therefore behave uniformly because God never changes.
I had a short forum discussion with some evolutionist biology students, and one of them kept writing the facts of evolution. And I dared to answer him saying, listen, it's so far your bravest ones are talking about theories. You talk about facts of evolution. Should we rather stay with the theory of evolution? This is widely accepted. John, I got the answer back. Plain sophisticated sophism. Yes, you're right. Evolution is a theory, but the theory of evolution is a fact. End of discussion, I said. My dear friend, you just caught me to the corner. Thank you so much. End of argument.
Well, it's certainly a piece of sophistry, because I did a debate in Wales last Saturday, right? And the atheist scientist, biologist who I was debating got up to introduce the subject in exactly that way. He said, now, the word theory in your mind means just a guess, but we scientists use theory in the same way as we use fact, right? So therefore, they've talked themselves into this, right?
Unbelievable.
But I love to remind people, in fact, you remember I said I've just recently been at St Andrews University, and prior to my coming, a week before, Richard Dawkins you know, the arch nemesis of anybody who believes in creation, and one of the most virulent anti-Christian, antagonistic speakers you could have in biology, was there. And of course, in order to prepare for my talk, I thought, well, he's been there a week before. I'm going to have to read up, find anything I can on this man, what he's saying now. And as part of that research, Dr. Diane Eager, who does a fair bit of research for us, actually found one of his interviews on PBS TV, right, in the UK. And just at the end of last year, he's asked by the interviewer, now, is evolution a theory or a fact? And Dawkins replies, evolution has been observed. It just hasn't been observed while it's been happening, right? And I thought, that's beautiful, right? Now that's an example of sophistry. But of course, if something hasn't actually been observed while it's been happening, then it hasn't been observed no matter how loud you say it, right? And you know the old politician's rule, if you've got a weak argument, shout some, right? And that's basically what he did. But it's sophistry, it's not truth. It's sophistry, it's not wisdom. It's sophistry, it's not even science. Because science is based on what's observable. And the reason for that is that when particularly Christianity began to penetrate man's brains, the Bible is one book which actually says, prove all things, right? And I do wish many Americans would do that when they watch some of their religious TV, because much of it is rubbish. But the reality is the Bible is the book which is the scientist's inspiration. So we shouldn't be surprised that many of the leaders in all fields of science, whether it's Gregor Mendel in genetics with a Christian worldview, or whether it's you know, some of the famous chemists or biologists like Carl von Linné, they all had a creation Christian worldview.
Is evolution a reason to believe Christianity or a reason to believe what? Could you please sort out this mess for me?
Okay. When you look at you and me, right, we live today. Now, if you can imagine there being life in outer space and a spaceship from Mars with little blue men arrived right here in the studio, not only would we be famous, right, because we caught it on the cameras, but in reality, those little blue men would say, I wonder what these are. How old are they? Okay, now, because they have never seen us grow, they would look at the data. There are big people, there are little people, and they may very well come up with a theory that as people age, they finally get so small till they go back inside somebody else, right? And disappear. Because that's possible from the data, if they were just here in an instant. Okay, now you and I live in this present world, and we can be here long enough to say, no, it's not like that. Mum gets pregnant, 9 months later, a little baby is born, and then it turns into an old man because I've watched it. Okay, so time and age is something you must experience, not something you can theorize about. Okay, now the problem with people like you, Ross, and many astronomers and that, is they're standing in the present and they're trying to come up with an age for the universe about a time in the past when they can't get to. Oh, they like to say, oh, we're looking at light that is 200 million years old. No, you're looking at light that's in your eye today, and you're telling me a story about 200 million years ago. So question, if you're standing here as the present day astronomer, biologist, geologist, you can have any theory you like about the future. All you need is a bit of patience and God's blessing for you to live long enough so you can check your theory. But if you're trying to get backwards, question, what way can you argue? And now we're talking sophistry, right? What way can you argue? In the end, there's only two choices. You can assume whatever you see around you now is the way it's always been. So I can measure the speed of light and I can divide it backwards and assume it's never changed, and I'll get answer A. Of course, if I stand here and assume that light has slowed down, I have a little bit more difficult problem, because it means I need some information from the beginning to know how and when it started. But you see, information from the beginning, how could you get it? You're in the here and now. There's only one choice. If somebody was there and they bothered to tell you. But that sounds too much like Genesis chapter 1. Now, herein is the sophistry problem. Last year, the Science Teachers Association defined science. and illustrated where the problem's coming from. Science today is defined as a heuristic method. Now, is that a word you use every day? No, you would probably say you test and observe things, right? It's much smaller, but heuristic is the big fancy word for it these days. And finally, in their big long definition, they said, without reference to God. Okay, so if God was there in the beginning and he told us what he did, a scientist has to choose to ignore it. Now, most people will go through science, and science has been like that for the past 150 years,
It sounds like dictatorship.
Well, it is. It's a mental dictatorship, right? Thought police is the other word for it. That's what's happening. And you'll find that people like Charles Darwin reaching the same conclusions using the same logic. And so where do they get that option from? Because up till Darwin's day, the theologians would have said, well, I've got my Bible, God was there, let's see what he said about the past. And then I'll use his principles to try and make use of the future. I mean, even Isaac Newton is on record as having dismissed students' exams who wrote that the pyramids were more than 6,000 or so years old, because he said there was nothing here 6,000 or so years ago, because God was creating the planet. So the pyramids can't be that old. Do you see his logic? God was there, he has told us. Okay, now Hugh Ross is basically saying, I'm living in the present, I'm going to ignore what Genesis really says, and I'm going to use another method to work backwards. Where's he getting his method from? Well, you may have to force him to the wall to get him to admit it, but here's his logic. The present is the key to the past. No, he doesn't get it from modern education, it's part of modern education. Where did they get it from? No, they didn't get it from Charles Darwin, but it's part of Charles Darwin. Where Charles Darwin got it from is a man called Charles Lyell, who was a lawyer, and lawyers are paid to play with words, right? So Charles Lyell, in the 1830s, wrote a book called Principles of Geology, in which he introduced a new way of thinking. It's otherwise known, I mean, there's his photo, or his picture rather, in the Natural History Museum in London, with a little ditty, the present is the key to the past. Now, we know why Charles Lyell introduced that, because in a letter to a friend in 1840, he said his aim was to free science from Moses. Why would he pick that little method? Answer, if you read Moses, the Bible says, one moment there was no creation, next moment there was. One moment there was no uranium, next moment there was. So if you assume uranium has always been falling to pieces like it is now, you'll be logical, you'll just be wrong. Okay, now Hugh Ross is assuming that whatever light is doing now, it has always done. And the Bible says, hang on a moment, God said, let there be
light.
And there was. So therefore, if you don't have data from the Creator who was there, and you just assume whatever it's like now, you will get a logical answer, but bless his little heart, it will be wrong. The problem is not simply that it's wrong, but where it leads you to. You see, Lyell's aim was to get rid of Moses. Okay, let's do it. We take light, we assume that it's like it's always been, we end up with a universe hundreds of millions to billions of years old. Now you read Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. In 6 days God made the heavens and the earth, and the seventh day he rested. Hang on, those hundreds of billions of years conflict with that. But if science is my authority, what do I do next? Well, I still want to be a Christian, so this has to somehow be true, but it can't be historically, literally true. So what I do is retreat from a literal reading and say, well, it must be symbols, or it must be poetry, or there's a gap between verse 1 and verse 2, or this is a progressive revelation of God revealing his creation over 6 billion years, or whatever figure you want. You are moving from reading it literally as a child would read it to moving it as a sophist would read it, till in the end it is meaningless. And you know, bless Hugh's little heart, but that's the result that he will in the end produce, because anyone who says, wow, you can't really take Genesis literally, has to face up to the fact that Jesus said, if you don't believe Moses, you won't believe me. And the less you can believe of Moses, really, the less you're actually teaching people to believe Jesus Christ.
If we click on www.creationresearch.net, is there any evidence to be found over there? On Creation Research's website, not just reasoning, because reasoning is just easy, you just flip with sophisms, but evidence is hard to be found today.
Well, you will find if you go to the search engine and just insert the word light, all of the counter opinions by physicists who are saying, look, we've got abundant evidence to show that light hasn't always been the same, right? And in fact, one astronomer who would be very anti-creation is actually out on the left wing all by himself with about another 20 or 30 saying, well, look, light doesn't show redshift because it's been behaving like a wave, therefore the Big Bang is true, so the universe is 10 billion, 15 billion, whatever the latest figure is, right? He said, it shows that because it's getting old.
Right.
The minute you say that, all of a sudden the whole picture that the astronomer, who's a Hugh Ross fan or one of Hugh Ross's colleagues, it totally disappears. So again, you reach the situation, there's plenty of theories, including Hugh Ross's, that contradict a literal reading of your Bible the way Jesus would have told you to come to it as a little child. But the facts, no, not the facts. Okay, the facts only support. In fact, I got into this sort of area because in 1978, Dr. John Eddy, the USA's leading high altitude research astronomer, is in print, and it's on there, right, saying, you know, whilst I believe the solar system's at least 4.6 billion years old, and that's older than you and me combined, right, we have no observational evidence to conflict even what Archbishop Usher said. Do you remember Archbishop Usher?
Yes.
Yeah, added it up literally as a little
6,000
child, well,
years.
it gets about 6,000.
So, dear folks, www.creationresearch.net, and you'll find not just the end of this story, but lots of other information. Coming to information, if you need any other information, regular information, free information from Creation Research, from John Mackay, pieces of truly scientific information with a little bit of editorial comment.
Comes out every couple of weeks,
Great.
and they can just go to the Evidence News button.
You'll get it right on your desktop. Just ask at info@creationresearch.net, and the proper scientific and biblical information is going to end up on your desktop. The subject today was history of education. I hope it was a blessed time for you. We wish you a blessed time with the Lord Jesus and with one another.